Hello, and welcome to A Reader's History of Science Fiction. I'm Alex Howe, and this is episode 32, Galactic Civilizations. I mean something rather specific by galactic civilizations in this context. Most of the interstellar civilizations we've seen so far have been either all human, especially back in the Golden Age, or have been fairly provincial in galactic terms, dealing with only a few alien species, like Larry Niven's known space universe. Obviously, there have been exceptions, Starmaker, Lensman, the original Star Trek. But as with the past couple episodes, I think there was something of a renaissance in the galactic civilization trope in the 70s and 80s, or specifically with galactic civilizations that include many different alien species. The earlier examples were pretty spotty on this point. Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy is obviously about a galactic empire, but that one is strictly human-based, and that gives it a very different dynamic. It's a strictly human drama, just played out on a larger stage. And yes, you could argue that all fiction is human drama, but sci-fi gives you the opportunity to do that in a very different way, by holding up the non-human as a contrast to the human. And Asimov didn't do this so much. Not with aliens, anyway. He did more with robots. Star Trek definitely did have this idea, but I think there's a subtle difference there. Star Trek was a show about exploration first and foremost, not the goings-on in the heart of the Federation. The Enterprise encountered many alien species, many of them very different from humans, but you don't see the sort of court intrigue that you do in Foundation or Dune. Does it even make sense to overlap the two? Well, maybe not a literal court, but political and military jockeying in a multi-species empire? Sure, as I will endeavor to show in this episode. And there's one example that gets pretty close to literal court intrigue. You see, the vision of a galaxy filled with countless varieties of alien life, all working together in a common civilization, began with Star Trek, but I argue it became cemented in the genre by the original Star Wars. Yes, we've gotten to the big one. I don't think I need to explain this one to you. If you haven't seen Star Wars, why are you listening to this podcast? I mean, I'm not saying you have to. It's just that for multiple generations of people now, at least in the Western world, Star Wars was, if not the first, then certainly the most mainstream introduction to science fiction they were ever going to get. I've mentioned multiple times that the Wikipedia article for the history of science fiction never once mentioned Star Trek or Star Wars, something that is still true as of this recording, which is honestly kind of strange. Even though the history of sci-fi is primarily characterized by books, Star Wars absolutely holds a special place in that history. I mean, just look at the numbers. Star Wars is the second highest grossing film franchise of all time, after the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Adjusted for inflation, the original Star Wars itself is the fourth highest grossing movie of all time, after Gone with the Wind, Avatar, and Titanic. And while I'm not completely sure it's accurate, Wikipedia lists it as the fifth highest grossing media property of all time, after Pokemon, Hello Kitty, Winnie the Pooh, and Mickey Mouse. Which makes it a shame that it's less science fiction and more science fantasy, but it certainly got the trappings of sci-fi down. Also, the fact that Disney owns 3 of the top most lucrative media properties on the planet is a little bit unsettling, but I digress. Star Wars is important because it has the widest exposure of pretty much any science fiction up until Avatar and the MCU. More on those in a future episode. But it's also important because it holds a special place as a turning point in the history of sci-fi. 2 major films, 2001: A Space Odyssey and the original Star Wars, are widely credited with getting sci-fi films off the ground again. I talked back in episode 18 about sci-fi movies in the Golden Age, where there were a lot of notable but kind of B-movie titles in the 50s and early 60s. After this, however, there was a long drought of lackluster films in the genre, which 2001 in fact falls right in the middle of. You'll still recognize some major titles during this period, but much like hard sci-fi in books, the genre as a whole had lost a lot of its appeal. 2001, and eventually Star Wars changed that, and the box office numbers prove it. After Star Wars came the renaissance in sci-fi films that you see in the 80s, often of the cyberpunk variety, which will also come up in a few episodes, but that was hardly the only category to benefit. For example, I've often heard Star Wars credited with getting Star Trek its first movie, which then led to sequels and eventually 7 new spin-off series and counting. Star Wars, especially in the newer movies, shows many different alien species working together under one banner. Well, 2 banners, you know what I mean. And in fact, this became relevant to the plot. In the books, Timothy Zahn, who was probably the most defining author of the old expanded universe, recast the Empire as a human chauvinist organization, as if calling their soldiers stormtroopers weren't obvious enough. They really made an effort in the franchise to show a diverse galaxy, at least species-wise. We can debate the human side of it. But at the same time, Star Wars doesn't use this to its full potential. The actual traits of the different species mostly aren't relevant to the plot outside Chewie and the droids. The Ewoks, the Gungans, the Kaminoans, the Mon Calamari, most of them could just be humans in funny costumes, just with some cultural differences. You mostly don't see what you do with Larry Niven, where the aliens can be fundamentally different in both psyche and physical capabilities. The best examples of galactic civilization, in my opinion, are more like Star Trek, where even though most of the aliens are just humans in funny costumes, they do go pretty far afield from the human norm some of the time. And you do see these kinds of ideas a lot in the literature of the same period, and not just in known space. Unhindered by budgets and 2-hour runtimes, sci-fi authors have the space to go wild, and you can find quite a few examples around this time. In fact, now that I think about it, even The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy falls into that category, although Douglas Adams uses it for comedic effect. Actually, before I go into the main examples for the episode, there's one other trend that I didn't notice until I was writing the script this week. This was also the time period when sci-fi book series were becoming a much bigger deal. That may sound a little strange. We've seen series before, especially in the pulp era. But in the 50s, 60s, and even 70s, most of the books on the lists of classics are standalones. And even for the ones that aren't, look at the dates. Ringworld, Book 2 in 1980. Space Odyssey, Book 2 in 1982. The Caves of Steel, Book 2 in 1957, but Book 3 in 1983. Even A Wrinkle in Time had its longest gap between the first 2 books, 11 years from 1962 to 73. The only real exception outside of anthologies seems to be James Blish's Cities in Flight. Meanwhile, more than half of the classic sci-fi novels published from 1977 onwards have sequels, and nearly all of them starting from the late 80s. Why is this? Did the popularity of Star Wars as a series spill over into books? Was it the Star Trek generation growing up and starting their own writing careers? Was it the Star Trek revival itself showing the potential of a longer series? I don't know. I suspect it was a bit of all of these, and I've put a couple links in the description that explore the phenomenon further. But I mention this because this is the first episode where it really comes up as a major factor. All 3 of the primary examples I have for Galactic Civilizations are book series, 2 of them long series at that. The first of the 3 is David Brin's Uplift Universe, starting with Sundiver in 1980 and continuing through a total of 6 books, along with a few side projects. The Uplift universe actually concerns an intergalactic civilization, although the distinction generally isn't important. Uplift refers to the process of aliens genetically modifying intelligent animals, the equivalent of dolphins or chimpanzees, into new sapient races. In fact, by the time humans make contact with the aliens, we've already uplifted both of these species ourselves. But the unusual feature of the Uplift universe is that every sapient species is created by Uplift. None of them ever naturally evolve sapients, because some alien race always gets to them first. None of them, that is, except humans. and this places humans in an interesting position. The other important feature of the Uplift universe is that uplifted species, the so-called client races, are legally indentured servants to their patron species for 100,000 years. Humans claim to have uplifted ourselves, the first species since the mysterious progenitors a billion years ago to do so. Most of the galaxy doesn't believe this, and instead thinks humans were abandoned by their patron, but they can't prove it. And the fact that we've already uplifted client species of our own gives us enough proverbial street cred to keep our independence. And there's a lot going on here with Brin's real-world philosophy and even politics. He's a big fan of real-life uplift, along with cloning extinct species, and cautiously building artificial intelligences. Bringing new species into our society, he says, could help us solve current and future problems by adding different points of view to our Homo sapiens ways of thinking, and he reflects that in the Uplift books. I'll note that Brin has a tendency to lean into the humans are special trope here, which is kind of questionable. But in his case, it's a justified trope. First, in one sense, I think he wants to inspire humans to be special in real life. But more generally, he implicitly invokes this trope as a solution to the Fermi paradox. If intelligent life is common in the universe, why haven't we seen any aliens yet? He doesn't do this so much in Uplift, but certainly in his 2012 standalone novel Existence. If aliens are rare in the universe, he says, then there must be something special about humans that has allowed us to get this far, even if we haven't reached the stars yet. I think the most recommended book of the Uplift series is the second book, Startide Rising. Sundiver is pretty high up there too, but it's set about 200 years earlier and isn't particularly connected with the rest of the series. Startide Rising concerns the Earth ship Streaker, which is the first ship with an all-dolphin crew, carrying just a few humans and one chimpanzee as observers. The Streaker stumbles upon a massive derelict fleet from the long-extinct progenitors, but this soon sparks a battle between various patron-client clans, with a quasi-religious devotion to the progenitors to possess the derelict fleet. And the Streaker struggles to escape the conflict in one piece. The consequences of this discovery are further explored in the next book, The Uplift War, and come up again in the Uplift Storm trilogy that follows it. Meanwhile, as we're talking about David Brin, I do have to put in a good word for Existence. Existence is his big, near-future alien contact novel, and thus far is also his last traditionally published novel. The main plot focuses around an alien contact with Earth of a very different kind, sometime around the year 2050. But there's a lot of other stuff going on. Existence is the book that introduced me to the really immersive style of world building, where you're thrown in the deep end and have to figure out the rules of this future world as you go. Brin even takes pains to invent a plausible slang and new tech terminology for the future. For example, in the future, everyone wears heads-up displays called eyewear, spelled AI-wear. And most relevant to this episode, Existence is also meant to be something of a loose prequel to the Uplift series. It would struggle to shoehorn itself in with the whole Uplift Galactic Civilization, but it does clearly show the first generation of uplifted dolphins. I was also lucky enough to get a signed copy of Existence. The summer when I was on a research project in Pasadena, I happened to see an advertisement for a local book signing Brin was doing. I had only vaguely heard of David Brin in passing before that through the Uplift series, but I loved the book when I read it. Anyway, there's a lot more I could say about Brin than I have time for here. He puts out a lot of his nonfiction writings on his website, and I encourage you to check it out for yourself if you want to know more. The second book series of note here is Iain M. Banks's Culture series. And this is an interesting one. The Culture series is quite possibly the most fully developed and unambiguous example of truly utopian fiction in all of literature. Banks takes the optimism of Star Trek and the promise of transhumanism as it was understood in the 90s and cranks them both up to 11. The culture is a post-scarcity society with supreme technology managed by artificial superintelligences. Many of the people live on miniature ring worlds called orbitals, or in massive country-sized starliners rather than planets. It's so advanced that it has no need for economics and almost none for government. A near-perfect anarcho-communist society, but one of an extreme voluntarist libertarian flavor that would make Robert Heinlein proud. The citizens of the culture are immortal, can be digitally resurrected if they die, and are genetically modified with various perks like regenerating lost limbs, conscious control of hormones, and even the ability to change biological sex at will, given a few weeks. They're also mostly humanoid aliens, although there are non-humanoid species around. However, the diversity in this setting comes more from artificial intelligence, with intelligent drones being widespread and enjoying full rights, and the real power, of course, being held by custom-built superintelligent AIs known as minds. As an aside, Elon Musk named his 3 drone ships that he lands rockets on, Just Read the Instructions, A Shortfall of Gravitas, and Of Course I Still Love You, after minds in the Culture series. Of course, it's not all sunshine and roses. Despite the lack of a traditional government, there are 2 self-organized groups of minds that do the culture's dirty work. The first is Contact, which handles foreign policy for the culture, and military operations in the rare cases when they're needed. And the second is the infamous Special Circumstances, which is the culture's espionage arm. Many of the books focus on these 2 organizations to keep things interesting. The Culture series totals 9 books and 1 short story collection. However, when reading the series, the recommended place to start is, again, the second book, The Player of Games. The Culture's timeline is more sprawling than Uplift, and not all in order, but the first book, Consider Phlebas, is still an outlier that people often suggest skipping at first. In addition to being regarded as not nearly as good, it's also set 5 centuries before any of the other books, so it's not well connected. The Player of Games is about Gernau Gerge, one of the best board game players in the whole of the culture. In a post-scarcity society, leisure activities are serious business. Gerge is blackmailed into helping Special Circumstances overthrow a brutal interstellar empire that is growing on the culture's doorstep. Why a board game player? Because in this empire, social and political rank are determined by a tournament of an incredibly complex board game that they believe is a model for administering society. It works surprisingly well as a story, even though the game itself is never really explained in a way that makes sense. The third story of note in this category is Vernor Vinge's A Fire Upon the Deep, and in this case it's specifically the 1 book. There are 3 books in the series, all of which are quite good. In fact, many people say A Deepness in the Sky is even better. But the other 2 books are much more provincial, and thus don't apply so much here. A Fire Upon the Deep has one of the most unusual galactic settings I've ever seen. Vinge takes the vast gaps in technology that you normally see across time in science fiction, between older civilizations and younger ones, for example, and turns the whole thing literally on its side. By some unspecified law of physics in his setting, the laws themselves change as you move outward from the center of the galaxy. Earth is in the slow zone, which means that faster-than-light travel and communication are impossible there. Those can only happen further out in the beyond, which itself has a gradient where they gradually work better as you go outward. Uploading people into computers is only possible at the very rim of the galaxy, in the transcend. Meanwhile, near the center of the galaxy, in a region called the Unthinking Depths, even electricity and biological brains cease to function. The plot of A Fire Upon the Deep is set into motion when a sealed horror called the Blight is accidentally released in the Transcend, a Borg-like entity that, unlike most powers there, which ascend to a higher plane of existence within a few years, seeks out to assimilate all life in the galaxy. A human ship carrying a mysterious countermeasure to the Blight crashes on a planet in the low beyond, populated by the Tynes, subsapient dog-like beings who can form sapient group minds via ultrasonic communication, and who live at a pre-industrial level of development. Honestly, the biology there is pretty silly. But it's a really clever idea. And if you're looking for aliens with very different psyches from humans, there you go. Also featuring prominently are the Scrode Riders, intelligent plants that lack a short-term memory and thus use computer assistants to function in normal society. Lots of strange stuff going on here. Incidentally, Vinge was the person who popularized the term technological singularity, which was later adopted by Ray Kurzweil. As a result, you see elements of transhumanism in A Fire Upon the Deep. But I think more interesting is the way he incorporates the new, real-world technology of the early 90s when the book was written. Most notably having the galaxy run on a text-based, message board-like communication system that looks an awful lot like the then state-of-the-art Usenet, and still captures a lot of the feel of the internet today. For all the weirdness, this book definitely feels ahead of its time. The other two books both keep themselves mostly to one planet, but they're still worthy follow-ups. A Deepness in the Sky is a prequel focusing on a fan-favorite character from the first book meeting bizarre, spider-like aliens who must periodically hibernate to survive the harsh conditions of their variable sun. And everyone seems to love A Deepness in the Sky, and it's pretty good, but I did not think it was off the charts good. And honestly, the ending just left me confused. Meanwhile, The Children of the Sky is a sequel to A Fire Upon the Deep, which is honestly not as good, but is still worth the read. It delves deeper into the Tyne society and presents a more well-rounded portrayal of them, and a pretty big cliffhanger that I really hope Vinge gets around to addressing at some point. Anyway, this has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is of course available on all the major platforms. I'm on YouTube at Science Meets Fiction. Look for a new science-y video there next weekend. My website is sciencemeetsfiction.com, and new this week, I am now on Twitter, if you prefer to get your news from there. You can find me there at sci-meetsfiction, since usernames have to be 15 letters or fewer. For my book recommendation, as much as I loved Existence, it's really peripheral to the theme of this episode. Instead, I'm going to go with A Fire Upon the Deep by Vernor Vinge. It's a fun story that goes in some interesting new directions, and does just as good a job as Brin and Banks at portraying a complex and compelling galactic civilization. In the next episode, we'll look at one specific aspect of space exploration that has come up before, but not so much as a distinct subgenre. It's time for a closer look at military sci-fi. Thanks for listening.